Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unlikely places. Sometimes it takes someone who cannot see your scars to help you heal from them. In a Viking longhouse filled with warriors, a blind woman named Thyra accidentally sat next to Bjorn the Stonehand, the most feared berserker in Norway. Everyone expected him to react with rage. Nobody was prepared for what actually happened. Bjorn was known for crushing enemies without mercy. His reputation made grown men tremble. But when this gentle woman sat beside him in the darkness, something inside the giant warrior began to change. Thyra couldn't see the scars covering his face. She couldn't see the fear in other men's eyes when they looked at him. All she knew was that someone had offered her a place by the warm fire on a cold winter night. What she said to him next would transform them both forever. But when war comes calling again, will their unlikely bond survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the fjords of Norway like the voices of ancient gods, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. Snow fell in heavy curtains outside the great longhouse of Jarl Svein Ironbeard, where the warmth of crackling fires and the glow of oil lamps created a sanctuary against the merciless cold. Inside these timber walls, decorated with the shields and weapons of 3 generations of warriors, the most feared men of the northern seas gathered to feast and share tales of conquest. At the head of the great hall sat Jarl Svein himself, a man whose grey beard reached nearly to his belt and whose eyes held the wisdom of 40 winters spent raiding and ruling. His longhouse stretched nearly 100 paces from end to end, its roof supported by massive oak beams carved with runes that told the stories of his ancestors. The central fire pit blazed with logs as thick as a man's torso, sending sparks dancing toward the smoke hole above, while casting long shadows across the faces of his guests. Tonight was no ordinary gathering. The harvest feast brought together warriors from across the region, men whose names were spoken in whispers and whose deeds had become legend. They sat on long wooden benches arranged in order of their standing, with the most honored closest to the fire and the Jarl's high seat. Drinking horns filled with mead passed from hand to hand, and the air, thick with smoke, carried the rich aroma of roasted meat and the salt tang of the nearby sea. But even among these legendary figures, one man commanded a space of reverent fear. At the Jarl's right hand, separated by a respectful distance from the other warriors, sat Bjorn the Stonehand. His massive frame dwarfed the bench beneath him, and his presence seemed to absorb the very light around him. Standing, he measured nearly 7 feet in height, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown ox. His hair, black as a moonless night, hung in thick braids adorned with silver rings earned in battle. But it was not his size alone that made grown men avert their eyes when he looked their way. Scars told the story of Bjorn's life across every visible inch of his skin. 3 parallel lines ran from his left temple to his jaw, the work of a bear's claws during his 15th winter. A jagged mark curved around his throat, where a Saxon blade had nearly ended his saga before it truly began. His hands, massive and calloused from years of wielding his legendary axe, bore the marks of countless battles, each scar a testament to an enemy who had failed to bring him down. His weapon, the great battle axe known as Grimnir, rested against the wall behind him within easy reach. The weapon stood as tall as most men, its double-headed blade forged from the finest steel and inscribed with runes of victory. The handle, carved from ash wood and wrapped in leather stained dark with the blood of his enemies, had never failed him in 20 years of warfare. Warriors spoke of Grimnir in hushed tones, claiming the axe sang when it tasted blood, and that its very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of war. Bjorn's reputation had grown with each passing season until his name became synonymous with death itself. From the shores of Ireland to the walls of Constantinople, enemies knew to fear the sight of his dragon-headed longship appearing on the horizon. He had never retreated from battle. never shown mercy to those who opposed him, and never failed to claim victory for his Jarl. The other warriors respected him, certainly, but they also kept their distance, understanding instinctively that Bjorn the Stonehand walked a path that few could follow, and fewer still could survive. Yet, for all his fearsome reputation, those who looked closely might have noticed something in Bjorn's pale blue eyes that spoke of deeper wounds than any weapon could inflict. He sat apart not only because others feared him, but because he had grown accustomed to solitude. His childhood had ended abruptly when raiders burned his family's farm, leaving him orphaned at the age of 10. Jarl Svein had taken him in, recognizing the fire of vengeance that burned in the boy's heart and molding it into a weapon of terrible efficiency. The years had hardened Bjorn's heart until it seemed carved from the very stone that gave him his name. He spoke little, smiled less, and formed no bonds that might make him vulnerable. His loyalty belonged to Jarl Svein and to the warriors who followed him into battle, but his affection belonged to no one. Love, he had learned, was a luxury that warriors could not afford, a weakness that enemies would exploit without hesitation. As the feast continued around him, Bjorn observed the revelry with detached interest. Young warriors boasted of their prowess, while their elders nodded approvingly or corrected their technique. Skolds sung tales of ancient heroes, while the fire crackled and mead flowed freely. The familiar sounds and smells of celebration surrounded him, yet he remained separate, an island of stillness in a sea of joyous chaos. Near the great doors of the longhouse, Jarl Svein's wife Astrid moved gracefully among the guests, ensuring that cups remained full and that the proper courtesies were observed. A woman of middle years whose beauty had ripened into something regal and commanding, she possessed a wisdom that complemented her husband's strength. Her children, now grown and married with families of their own, had inherited both their father's courage and their mother's keen intelligence. The conversation around the hall turned inevitably to matters of war and politics. Raiders from Denmark had been testing the borders, and rumours spoke of Saxon armies massing in the south. Trade routes that had remained profitable for years were becoming increasingly dangerous, and several jarls had already begun preparing their warriors for what seemed an inevitable conflict. "The Danes grow bolder with each passing season," declared Eric Bloodaxe, a grizzled veteran whose reputation rivaled even Bjorn's. "They think us weakened by prosperity and soft living." Jarl Svein stroked his iron-grey beard thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is time to remind them why our fathers carved their names so deeply into the memory of the world. What say you, Bjorn? Are you ready to teach these Danish dogs the meaning of Norse fury?" Bjorn's response came in his characteristic low rumble, a voice like distant thunder that seemed to rise from the very depths of his massive chest. "I am always ready, my Jarl. Grimnir thirsts for Danish blood." A murmur of approval rippled through the gathered warriors. They had seen Bjorn in battle, had witnessed the terrible poetry of destruction that he composed with his axe. When the time came to face their enemies, they would follow him into the very jaws of death itself, confident that his presence alone might tip the scales in their favor. But as the evening wore on and the mead continued to flow, the atmosphere began to shift. The formal discussion of warfare gave way to storytelling, and the storytelling gradually transformed into something approaching celebration. Warriors who had spent months at sea or in distant lands shared tales of their adventures, and laughter began to echo from the smoke-stained rafters. It was during this transition from serious discourse to jovial fellowship that the great doors of the longhouse creaked open once again. A figure stepped through, small and hesitant, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden assault of warmth, light, and sound that greeted them. The newcomer paused just inside the threshold, one hand gripping a walking staff of worn ashwood, while the other sought some point of reference in the unfamiliar environment. The figure was that of a young woman, perhaps 20 winters in age, with hair the color of ripened wheat that had been braided simply and allowed to fall across one shoulder. Her clothing, while clean and well-maintained, spoke of modest circumstances: a woolen dress dyed deep blue, a cloak that had seen many seasons, and leather shoes that had walked many miles. But it was her eyes that marked her as different from the other women in the hall. They were beautiful, a clear grey like morning mist over calm water, but they looked without seeing, focusing on nothing while somehow taking in everything. Thyra had been travelling for 3 days through the bitter cold, guided by the kindness of strangers and the hope that Jarl Svein's reputation for hospitality extended beyond his warriors. Her parents, humble farmers who had worked a small plot of land near the coast, had succumbed to a wasting sickness that had swept through the region like wildfire. With no other family to turn to and winter approaching fast, she had gathered her few possessions and set out in search of shelter and the possibility of honest work. The walking staff in her hand had been her father's, carved with care during the long winter nights when the work of farming gave way to the craft of woodworking. Its surface bore the smooth patina of countless miles, and its familiar weight provided both physical support and emotional comfort in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and strange. Around her neck, hidden beneath the folds of her dress, hung a small silver pendant that contained a single braid of her mother's hair. It was the only treasure she possessed, more valuable to her than gold, because it carried with it the memory of gentle hands that had combed her hair each morning, and loving words that had guided her through the challenges of growing up blind in a world designed for the sighted. As Thyra stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sounds and smells of the great hall, she had no way of knowing that her arrival would set in motion events that would change not only her own destiny, but the fate of the most feared warrior in all of Norway. The hall fell silent as every eye turned toward the small figure standing in the doorway. Thyra hesitated, her free hand extended slightly as she tried to orient herself in the vast space. The sudden quiet after the boisterous celebration felt heavy and expectant, though she could not see the expressions of curiosity and concern that marked the faces around her. Astrid was the first to move, rising gracefully from her place near the Jarl's high seat and approaching the newcomer with the measured dignity of a woman accustomed to managing both household and guests. Her voice carried the warmth of genuine hospitality when she spoke. "Welcome, child. The storm grows fierce tonight. Come, warm yourself by our fire." Thyra's shoulders relaxed at the gentle tone, and she took a tentative step forward, her staff tapping against the wooden floor. "Thank you, my lady. I seek shelter and perhaps work, if any might be found. I am Thyra, daughter of Olaf, the farmer." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors as they recognized the name. Olaf had been known as an honest man who sold grain to the longhouse stores, though few had met his daughter. The silver pendant at her throat caught the firelight as she moved, and several of the older women exchanged glances that spoke of understanding and sympathy. "Olaf's daughter," Jarl Svein said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine sorrow. "We heard of the sickness that took your parents. You have our condolences, child." Thyra bowed her head in acknowledgement, her fingers tightening on her father's staff. "They died as they lived, my lord, with honor and love for each other. I ask no charity, only the chance to earn my place through honest work." As she spoke, Thyra began to move carefully through the hall, using her staff to navigate between the benches and around the seated warriors. The familiar weight of the ash wood in her hand provided confidence, and her other senses, sharpened by years of reliance, guided her past obstacles she could not see. The warriors watched her progress with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Her grace, despite her blindness, impressed them, but they were unsure how to respond to this unexpected disruption of their feast. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward with genuine curiosity about this young woman who carried herself with such quiet dignity. Thyra moved steadily toward the warmth of the central fire, drawn by its heat and the promise of rest after days of cold travel. In the shifting light and smoke, with conversations resuming around her in lowered tones, She could not perceive the exact arrangement of the seating or understand the significance of proximity to the Jarl's high seat. What she sensed was an empty space on a bench near the fire, a gap that seemed to offer exactly what she needed: warmth, rest, and a place to gather her thoughts. Without hesitation, guided by instinct and exhaustion, she made her way toward it and carefully seated herself, placing her staff against the wall behind her and pulling her cloak more tightly around her shoulders. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow even the crackling of the fire. Thyra had unknowingly seated herself directly beside Bjorn the Stonehand. Every warrior in the hall held his breath. Several hands moved instinctively toward weapon hilts, not in preparation for violence, but in nervous reaction to witnessing something unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. The space beside Bjorn was never occupied, not from any formal rule, but from the unspoken understanding that proximity to the berserker required either invitation or extraordinary courage. Bjorn himself sat frozen, his massive hands clenched into fists on his knees. The familiar rage that had served him in countless battles began to build in his chest, the fury at this breach of protocol, this violation of the careful distance that others maintained around him. His pale eyes flicked toward Grimnir, resting against the wall within easy reach, and for a moment the hall teetered on the edge of violence. But then Thyra spoke, her voice soft and filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for sharing your fire, friend. The cold has been my companion these past days, and your kindness is a blessing I had not dared hope for." The words cut through Bjorn's rising anger like a blade through silk. She had called him friend. No one had called him friend in longer than he could remember. The simplicity and sincerity of her gratitude struck something deep within him that had been buried for so many years he had forgotten its existence. He turned slightly to look at her more closely, taking in the delicate features marked by hardship but not broken by it. Her unseeing eyes gazed toward the fire with an expression of peaceful contentment, and he realized that she had no idea who sat beside her. She could not see the scars that marked him as a killer, could not read the fear in other men's faces when they looked upon him. To her, he was simply someone who had made room by a warm fire on a cold night. The tension in the hall remained thick as honey as warriors waited to see how their most dangerous member would respond to this unprecedented situation. Some expected an explosion of violence, others prepared to intervene if the innocent young woman faced the berserker's wrath. But none were prepared for what actually occurred. Bjorn unclenched his fists and let his hands rest naturally on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the menace that usually accompanied his words. "The fire burns warm tonight. You are welcome to its heat." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the entire hall, though the tension did not entirely dissipate. Warriors exchanged glances of amazement, uncertain whether they had witnessed mercy or merely the calm before a storm. Jarl Svein leaned forward slightly, his keen eyes studying his most valuable warrior with newfound interest. Thyra smiled, an expression of pure warmth that transformed her entire face. "You speak with kindness, though I hear weariness in your voice. Have you traveled far as well?" The question caught Bjorn off guard. No one asked him about weariness or travel or anything personal beyond his readiness for battle. He found himself considering how to answer, weighing words with care he had not employed in years. "I have traveled far from the boy I once was," he said finally, surprised by his own honesty. "We all travel that road," Thyra replied softly. "Sometimes I think the longest journeys are the ones we make within ourselves. My parents used to say that the heart knows distances the feet can never measure." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed to come from someone much older, and Bjorn found himself nodding despite himself. Around them, the hall began to return to normal activity as conversations resumed and mead continued to flow. But something fundamental had shifted, though few could have articulated exactly what had changed. As the evening wore on, Astrid approached with food and drink for their unexpected guest. studying the scene before her with the sharp intelligence that had made her an invaluable advisor to her husband. She had seen Bjorn in many situations, planning battles, treating with enemies, dispensing justice, but never like this. The giant warrior sat perfectly still, listening as Thyra spoke quietly about her journey and her hopes for finding work that would allow her to contribute rather than merely survive. "I learned to carve bone and wood from my father," she was saying, her hands moving gracefully as she described her craft. "Though I cannot see the patterns, I can feel them with my fingers. My mother always said I could find beauty in places others might overlook." Bjorn watched her hands as she spoke, noting their grace and the calluses that spoke of honest work. He found himself imagining what it might be like to create something beautiful rather than to destroy, to bring joy rather than fear. The thought was so foreign to his nature that it almost made him laugh, yet something about her presence made it seem less impossible than it should have. When Jarl Svein finally rose to formally end the feast, offering Thyra guest quarters for the night and the promise of discussing work arrangements in the morning, Bjorn remained seated as the hall began to empty. Thyra gathered her cloak and reached for her staff, preparing to follow Astrid to whatever shelter had been arranged. Before she could rise, Bjorn spoke once more. "Your parents were wise people. Their daughter honors their memory." Thyra turned toward his voice, and though her eyes could not meet his, her smile radiated genuine warmth. "Thank you, friend. Perhaps we might speak again tomorrow?" As she disappeared into the shadows beyond the dying fire, Bjorn sat alone with thoughts more complex than any he had entertained in years. The rage that had defined him for so long seemed strangely distant, replaced by something he could not name, but found unexpectedly peaceful. For the first time in memory, the most feared warrior in Norway went to sleep that night, thinking not of tomorrow's battles, but of a blind woman's gentle smile. Dawn broke grey and cold over the longhouse, with frost painting intricate patterns on the windows and the wind carrying the promise of snow. Inside the great hall, servants moved quietly about their tasks, banking fires and preparing for the day's activities. The warriors who had feasted so heartily the night before were slower to rise, nursing sore heads and reflecting on the unprecedented events they had witnessed. Word of Thyra's encounter with Bjorn the Stonehand spread through the household like wildfire. Servants whispered in the kitchens, warriors debated in the armory, and even the stable boys found excuses to linger near the main hall in hopes of catching a glimpse of the blind woman who had somehow managed to sit beside the berserker and live to tell the tale. Thyra herself woke in a small but comfortable chamber that Astrid had prepared for her, warmed by heavy furs and illuminated by a shaft of pale morning light. The kindness she had been shown the previous evening filled her heart with gratitude, but also with determination to prove herself worthy of such generosity. She had not come seeking charity, and she would not remain as a burden. Rising carefully from the soft bed, she retrieved her father's walking staff and the small leather pouch that contained her bone-carving tools. These implements, worn smooth by years of use, represented her only marketable skill and her best hope for securing a place in the household. The carved pieces themselves were few. She had sold most of her work during the journey to pay for food and lodging, but what remained demonstrated the delicate artistry that had made her father proud. As she made her way through the longhouse, guided by memory and the subtle sounds that revealed the layout of the great hall, Thyra became aware of the attention her presence drew. Conversations paused as she passed, and she could sense eyes following her movement. The awareness might have been unsettling, but her blindness had long ago taught her to distinguish between malicious interest and mere curiosity. What surrounded her now felt more like wonder than threat. Near the central hearth, she discovered a low stool that seemed unoccupied and settled herself there with her carving tools spread on a cloth beside her. The morning light provided no guidance for her work, but her fingers needed none. She selected a piece of deer bone that she had been shaping for weeks, feeling along its surface for the emerging pattern that would transform raw material into art. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, the small iron knife tracing delicate lines, while her fingertips read the texture like others might read runes. What emerged under her touch was a representation of interwoven vines and flowers, executed with such precision that observers might have doubted a sighted person could achieve such detail. Astrid was among the first to notice the quality of Thyra's work, approaching quietly and studying the carving with genuine appreciation. The Jarl's wife had an eye for craftsmanship, having supervised the household's artistic endeavors for many years, and she recognized exceptional skill when she encountered it. "Your talent is remarkable," Astrid said softly, careful not to startle the young woman. Thyra looked up from her carving, a smile brightening her features. "Thank you, my lady. My father taught me that beauty exists in all things, waiting for patient hands to reveal it. Though I cannot see the finished piece, I can feel when the work is true." Their conversation drew the attention of other household members, including several of the craftsmen who maintained weapons and created the decorative objects that reflected the longhouse's wealth and status. Master Gunnar, the chief woodcarver responsible for the intricate panels that adorned the hall, examined Thyra's work with the critical eye of a professional. "The girl has rare ability," he declared to those gathered around. "These hands could create treasures worthy of jarls and kings." Word of this assessment reached Jarl Svein himself, who made time in his morning routine to observe Thyra's work personally. The political mind that had guided his people through decades of prosperity immediately grasped the practical implications. Skilled artisans brought prestige to a household, and their work could be traded for valuable goods or given as gifts to cement important alliances. But even as Thyra demonstrated her worth through her craft, another drama unfolded in the training yards behind the longhouse. Bjorn had risen before dawn, as was his custom, and made his way to the practice grounds, where he honed the skills that had made him legendary. His routine never varied precise movements with Grimnir, exercises to maintain his massive strength, and solitary meditation that prepared his mind for whatever challenges the day might bring. This morning, however, his concentration proved elusive. Images of the previous evening's encounter kept intruding on his thoughts. Thyra's gentle smile, her words about the heart-knowing distances the feet could never measure, the way she had called him friend without hesitation or fear. The distraction affected his performance in ways that would have been imperceptible to casual observers, but felt enormous to him. Eric Bloodaxe, arriving for his own morning training, noticed the subtle changes immediately. He had fought alongside Bjorn for more than a decade and could read the giant's moods like weather signs. Something had shifted in the berserker's usual perfect focus, and Eric's curiosity about the cause led him to probe carefully. "You seemed thoughtful during the feast last night," Eric said as he began his own weapon exercises. The blind girl's presence stirred quite a reaction in the hall. Bjorn's response came after a long pause, each word chosen with unusual care. "She possesses courage. To travel alone in her condition, to seek honest work rather than pity, these are not common qualities." The admission surprised Eric, who had rarely heard Bjorn express admiration for anyone outside of battle contexts. But before he could pursue the subject further, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of younger warriors eager to train with two of the most respected fighters in the region. As the morning progressed and training gave way to the day's regular activities, subtle tensions began to emerge throughout the Longhouse community. Some warriors whispered that Bjorn's restraint the previous evening demonstrated weakness, that a true berserker would have reacted with immediate violence to such a breach of protocol. Others argued that showing mercy to a helpless woman required greater strength than simple brutality. These debates might have remained harmless speculation, but they reflected deeper uncertainties about the changing nature of their world. The old ways, built on strength and fear, were being challenged by new realities that required different skills and approaches. Thyra's presence had somehow crystallized these tensions in ways that made some men uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Thyra herself remained unaware of the complex reactions her arrival had generated. She worked steadily at her carving, pausing occasionally to accept offers of food or drink from household members who found excuses to observe her technique. The bone piece gradually transformed under her skilled touch, revealing intricate patterns that spoke of both technical mastery and artistic vision. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the great hall, Astrid made a decision that would formalize Thyra's position in the household. Approaching Jarl Svein with the confidence of a woman whose counsel had proven valuable countless times, she presented her proposal with characteristic directness. "The girl possesses skills we can use and character we should honor. Grant her a place among our craftspeople, and her work will bring credit to our house while providing for her needs." Jarl Svein considered the request with the measured deliberation that had served him well in matters both large and small. The practical benefits were clear, but he also recognized the symbolic importance of the decision. How they treated this vulnerable stranger would reflect the values they claimed to uphold. His agreement, when it came, was decisive and public, announced in a voice that carried throughout the hall and left no room for doubt about Thyra's new status. She would have quarters, meals, and the resources needed for her craft, in exchange for work that would contribute to the household's prosperity and reputation. As news of this arrangement spread throughout the longhouse, Thyra felt tears of gratitude gathering in her sightless eyes. The days that followed Thyra's acceptance into the household settled into a rhythm that seemed both natural and subtly revolutionary. Her place in the great hall became established near the central hearth, where the light was best for those who wished to observe her work, and the warmth most comfortable for long hours of detailed carving. The bone-carving tools that had been her father's legacy now served as the foundation for a new life, their worn handles growing more familiar with each passing day. Thyra's integration into the longhouse community proved smoother than many had expected. The servants found her easy to work with, grateful for help but never demanding, and possessed of a gentle humor that brightened even mundane tasks. The craftsmen welcomed her expertise, discovering that her heightened sense of touch allowed her to detect flaws in materials that might escape visual inspection. Master Gunnar, initially skeptical about working with someone whose methods differed so dramatically from his own, became one of her most enthusiastic advocates. "She feels the grain of the wood like others read runes," he told anyone who would listen. "Her hands know truths that eyes often miss." This praise carried weight throughout the community, establishing Thyra's reputation as more than merely a curiosity or an object of sympathy. The pieces she completed during her first week, a hair ornament for Astrid, a drinking cup adorned with intricate patterns, and a small figurine that captured the essence of a running deer, demonstrated skills that would have been remarkable in any craftsperson. The fact that she achieved such results without sight made her work seem almost magical. But while Thyra found her place among the household's artisans with relative ease, her presence continued to create ripples of effect throughout the longhouse community. The warriors, particularly the younger ones eager to prove themselves, struggled to understand how to interact with someone who challenged their fundamental assumptions about strength and vulnerability. Some treated her with exaggerated courtesy that bordered on condescension, while others seemed determined to ignore her entirely. The most significant ongoing tension centered around Bjorn's changed behavior since that first night. The berserker had not spoken to Thyra again since their initial encounter, but his awareness of her presence was obvious to anyone who knew how to read his subtle signs. He found reasons to pass through the great hall more frequently than his usual routine required, and his position during meals shifted slightly to provide a clearer view of her workspace. These changes might have gone unnoticed by casual observers, but the warriors who had served with Bjorn for years recognized the significance of any alteration in his patterns. Eric Bloodaxe, whose friendship with the giant stretched back to their youth, felt increasingly concerned about what he interpreted as a dangerous distraction. The concern came to a head during weapons practice on the 5th day after Thyra's arrival. Bjorn's performance remained technically flawless, but Eric detected a subtle lack of the absolute focus that had always characterized the berserker's approach to combat. When their sparring session ended, Eric decided to address the issue directly. "Your mind seems divided lately," he said bluntly, setting his practice sword aside and studying his friend's reaction. "In battle, such division kills warriors." Bjorn's response came slowly, as if he were examining his own thoughts for the first time. "Perhaps my mind has been too focused on killing for too long. The girl speaks of creating beauty rather than destroying enemies. It is a perspective I had not considered." The admission troubled Eric more than outright denial would have. He had built his understanding of Bjorn on the foundation of the man's single-minded dedication to warfare. This suggestion of broader interests felt like a fundamental shift that could have unpredictable consequences. "Beauty is a luxury for those who do not face steel in battle," Eric replied carefully. "Your reputation keeps our enemies at bay as much as our swords. Would you call mercy weakness?" Bjorn's question carried an edge that reminded Eric why so many men feared to contradict the berserker. The girl has faced hardships that would break warriors, yet she seeks to create rather than destroy. Perhaps there is strength in such choices. Their conversation ended without resolution, leaving Eric to carry his concerns to others who might share his perspective. But his attempts to rally support for intervention met with mixed responses. Some warriors agreed that Bjorn's behavior warranted attention, while others argued that any change was his own affair as long as his effectiveness in battle remained undiminished. Meanwhile, Thyra herself remained largely unaware of the debates her presence had sparked among the fighting men. Her days filled with the satisfaction of productive work, conversations with fellow craftspeople, and the growing sense that she had found not just shelter, but a genuine community. The silver pendant containing her mother's hair, worn close to her heart, seemed to provide approval for this new direction in her life. Her interactions with the household's women proved particularly rewarding. Astrid included her in the daily planning sessions where meals, supplies, and social obligations were organized. The younger women, initially intimidated by her difference, gradually warmed to her gentle manner and discovered that blindness had not prevented her from developing insights into human nature that proved remarkably astute. "You see people clearly despite your eyes," observed Sigrid, one of the servant girls who had become a particular friend. "How do you manage such understanding?" Thyra smiled as she continued working on a new carving, her fingers tracing delicate patterns in a piece of whalebone destined to become a comb. "When you cannot see faces, you learn to hear the truth in voices. People reveal themselves through words and actions more clearly than through appearance." This wisdom, shared during quiet conversations in the evening hours after the day's work was done, began to influence how others in the household viewed both Thyra and themselves. Her presence encouraged reflection and introspection in ways that surprised many who had grown accustomed to lives focused primarily on external challenges and achievements. But even as Thyra established herself more firmly in the longhouse community, signs of approaching conflict began to gather like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Messengers arrived with increasing frequency, bringing news of Danish raids along the southern borders and Saxon movements that suggested coordinated military action. The feast, where Thyra had first encountered Bjorn, began to seem like a farewell to a more peaceful time. Jarl Svein called more frequent councils with his war leaders, and the discussions that emerged from these meetings carried an urgency that had been absent during the earlier, more theoretical conversations about potential threats. The time for preparation and planning was ending, and the time for decisive action was approaching. In the training yards, the intensity of practice sessions increased noticeably. Warriors who had been content with maintaining their skills now pushed themselves to achieve new levels of proficiency. Weapons were sharpened to killing edges, armor was inspected and reinforced, and the great war shields that had hung unused on the walls were brought down for repair and modification. Through all these preparations, Bjorn maintained his position as the Jarl's primary military advisor and most trusted weapon. His strategic insights remained as sharp as ever, and his presence continued to inspire confidence in the other warriors. But those who knew him best continued to sense the subtle changes in his demeanor, a thoughtfulness that had not been there before, a tendency toward reflection rather than immediate action. As the sun set on Thyra's first week in the longhouse, she settled into her now familiar place by the fire and took up her carving tools for the evening's work. The piece of amber she had selected presented new challenges, its translucent surface requiring different techniques than the bone and wood with which she was most familiar. Around her, the life of the longhouse continued its ancient rhythms, warriors maintaining their equipment, women managing household affairs, servants preparing for another day's requirements. But beneath this familiar surface, currents of change moved in directions that none could fully predict or control. The quiet revolution that had begun with a blind woman's simple act of sitting beside a feared berserker was gathering momentum, creating possibilities that had not existed before and challenges that would test everyone involved. Winter deepened its grip on the land as the second week of Thyra's residence in the longhouse began. The storms that had threatened during her arrival now descended with full fury, bringing snow that piled against the walls in great drifts and winds that howled like the voices of ancient spirits. Inside the warm sanctuary of Jarlsvine's hall, the contrast between the harsh world outside and the civilized community within seemed to emphasize both the value of shelter and the precarious nature of safety in such times. The intensifying weather coincided with increasingly urgent reports from the Jarl's scouts and messengers. Danish longships had been spotted along the coast, their distinctive sails cutting through grey waters despite conditions that would have deterred ordinary vessels. These were not the random raids of desperate men seeking quick plunder, but the deliberate movements of organized forces with strategic objectives. Bjorn found himself called more frequently to private councils with Jarl Svein, where maps were spread across tables and possible courses of action debated with the intensity that such decisions demanded. His military expertise, honed through decades of successful campaigns, proved invaluable in analyzing the Danish threat and developing responses that might preserve both the longhouse and the broader community it protected. Yet even during these crucial strategic sessions, Thyra's presence seemed to occupy a portion of his thoughts. Her quiet confidence as she worked at her carving, the gentle wisdom in her conversations with others, and the way she had transformed what might have been charity into genuine contribution, all of these factors challenged assumptions he had held without question for most of his adult life. The challenge became particularly acute during a war council where the discussion turned to the treatment of prisoners and civilians in the coming conflict. The traditional Viking approach emphasized strength and intimidation, using brutality against enemies as both practical necessity and psychological weapon. But listening to these familiar strategies, Bjorn found himself remembering Thyra's words about creating beauty rather than destruction, about finding strength in mercy rather than violence. "The Danes expect us to respond with predictable fury," he said during one such council, his words carrying the weight of experience. "Perhaps our advantage lies in approaches they do not anticipate." Jarl Svein studied his war leader with keen interest, recognizing something new in Bjorn's manner of expression. "What approaches do you suggest?" The question forced Bjorn to articulate ideas that were still forming in his own mind. Strategic precision instead of widespread destruction, targeted strikes against their leadership rather than slaughter of common fighters, victory achieved through superior planning rather than superior brutality. The proposal generated intense debate among the assembled war leaders. Some supported the innovative approach, arguing that unexpected tactics often proved most effective. Others worried that deviation from proven methods might be interpreted as weakness or uncertainty. Eric Bloodaxe found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and concern for approaches that seemed to contradict everything they had learned about successful warfare. While these discussions continued behind closed doors, life in the main hall proceeded with its own rhythms and tensions. Thyra's skills had attracted attention beyond the immediate household, with traders and visitors expressing interest in commissioning pieces from the blind artisan, whose work had begun to acquire a reputation for exceptional quality. Master Gunnar reported requests from other Jarls who had heard descriptions of her carvings and wished to obtain similar pieces for their own collections or as gifts for important allies. This external recognition brought both opportunities and complications. The income from commissioned work would provide Thyra with greater independence and security, but it also meant exposure to a wider world where not everyone would treat her blindness with the understanding she had found in Jarl Svein's household. Some visitors made comments or assumptions that revealed their perception of her as somehow diminished by her condition, attitudes that stirred protective instincts in those who had come to know her true capabilities. Astrid proved particularly effective at managing these situations, using her authority as the Jarl's wife to establish clear expectations about how guests would behave toward all members of the household. Her interventions were subtle but unmistakable, creating an environment where Thyra could work without harassment, while visitors learned to appreciate talent regardless of its unusual circumstances. The protective atmosphere extended beyond formal courtesy to genuine affection and respect. Thyra's gentle nature and evident skill had won her friends throughout the community, from the youngest servant girls who sought her advice about matters of the heart to the oldest craftsmen who valued her insights about technique and materials. Her presence had become woven into the daily fabric of longhouse life in ways that seemed both natural and irreversible. But this integration also highlighted the fundamental uncertainty of her position. As a woman without family or independent resources, her security depended entirely on the continued goodwill of her hosts. If circumstances changed, if war forced evacuation of the longhouse, if political alliances shifted, if economic pressures made her maintenance seem burdensome, she would have few alternatives and little control over her fate. These underlying vulnerabilities became more pressing as the military situation continued to deteriorate. Scouts reported that Danish forces were establishing camps along the coast, suggesting preparations for extended operations rather than quick raids. The threat no longer seemed seasonal or opportunistic, but part of a larger campaign that might last through the winter and into the following year. Jarl Svein's responses to these developments required increasingly difficult choices. Resources that might have been devoted to trade, craft production, or community improvement had to be redirected toward military preparations. Young men who had been learning peacetime skills found themselves thrust into intensive weapons training. Families began making plans for potential evacuation or siege conditions. In this atmosphere of growing tension, the relationship between Thyra and Bjorn acquired new complexity. Their interactions remained limited to brief encounters in the Great Hall and occasional exchanges of greetings, but these moments carried weight that others recognized, even when the principals themselves might not fully acknowledge it. Thyra had begun to associate the sound of Bjorn's footsteps with safety and stability, finding comfort in his presence even when they did not speak directly. His measured pace and quiet strength seemed to represent everything reliable about her new life, and she unconsciously oriented herself toward his location when uncertainty or anxiety arose. Bjorn, for his part, found his protective instincts engaged in ways that surprised him. The thought of Thyra facing danger because of her blindness generated responses that felt different from his usual professional concern for civilians in wartime. Her vulnerability seemed to demand not just general protection, but personal responsibility, a commitment that went beyond duty to something approaching devotion. This emotional development occurred without explicit acknowledgement from either party, communicated instead through small gestures and subtle attentions that outside observers noted, but the participants treated as natural expressions of friendship and mutual respect. The amber carving that Thyra had begun during her first week in the longhouse gradually took shape under her skilled fingers, revealing patterns that seemed to capture light even in the dim interior illumination. As the week drew to a close with no improvement in either weather or military situation, the longhouse community found itself poised between hope and fear, between the security they had built and the uncertainties that threatened to destroy everything they valued. In this precarious balance, relationships that had seemed simple revealed unexpected depth, and choices that had appeared obvious demanded reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about strength, loyalty, and the meaning of true courage. The moment Thyra had been unconsciously dreading arrived on a morning when frost painted the windows in intricate patterns and the air carried the sharp clarity that preceded heavy snow. She sat at her usual place near the central fire, working on a commission for a visiting merchant, a delicate pendant meant to commemorate his daughter's upcoming marriage. The bone responded beautifully to her touch, revealing layers of cream and pale gold that would make the finished piece particularly striking. Her concentration was so complete that she did not immediately notice when someone settled onto the bench beside her. The familiar weight and presence registered gradually, accompanied by the scent of leather and steel that she had begun to associate with safety and strength. When awareness finally penetrated her artistic focus, she realized that Bjorn the Stonehand was sitting next to her for the first time since that eventful first night. "Your work grows more beautiful each day," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying none of the edge that others found so intimidating. "The merchant will treasure such artistry." Thyra smiled, her hands continuing their delicate movements while her attention shifted to this unexpected conversation. "Thank you. I find that each piece teaches me something new about the materials and about myself. This bone has layers I did not expect, much like people, I suppose." The comparison struck Bjorn as particularly apt, considering his own recent discoveries about depths within himself that he had not known existed. He had been watching her work for days, fascinated by the way her fingers seemed to read the materials like others might read runes, finding patterns and possibilities that remained invisible until her tools revealed them. "You speak of learning from your work," he said after a thoughtful pause. "What has this piece taught you?" The question surprised Thyra with its genuine interest and philosophical depth. Most people asked about her techniques or expressed amazement at her ability to work without sight, but few inquired about the deeper aspects of her craft. She considered her response carefully, sensing that this conversation might be important in ways she could not yet understand. "This bone came from an old elk," she said, her fingers tracing the contours she had created. "The animal lived through many harsh winters, faced dangers I can only imagine. The scars from its struggles are part of its beauty now. They give the material character and strength. I think we all carry such marks, whether others can see them or not." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively toward his own scarred face, then stopped as he realized the unconscious gesture. Her words seemed to address something he had never spoken aloud, the way his visible scars marked him as dangerous, while his invisible wounds remained hidden from all observers. "Some scars run deeper than flesh," he said quietly, echoing her words from that first night. "Not all marks of battle can be seen." "But they need not define us," Thyra replied gently. "The elk's scars became part of its strength, not its weakness. Perhaps the same is true for people." Their conversation continued in this vein for some time, touching on subjects that Bjorn had never discussed with anyone. Thyra's gentle questions and thoughtful responses created space for reflections he had avoided for years about the cost of his reputation, the isolation that came with being feared, and the possibility that strength might take forms other than violence and intimidation. For Thyra, The exchange provided insights into the man behind the fearsome reputation. His thoughtfulness surprised her, as did the evident pain that underlay his careful words. She began to understand that his presence beside her represented not casual interest, but something approaching courage, the willingness to be seen as human rather than simply as a weapon. Their quiet dialogue was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger whose urgent manner and travel-stained appearance indicated news of significant importance. The man approached Jarl Svein's high seat with the formal courtesy required for such occasions, but his obvious exhaustion and concern suggested that pleasantries would be brief. "My lord," the messenger said, bowing deeply before continuing, "I bring word from the southern settlements. Danish forces have landed in force near Stavanger. They have not come for quick raids. They bring equipment for siege warfare and supplies for extended operations." The news struck the hall like a physical blow, instantly transforming the atmosphere from casual morning activity to focused preparation for crisis. Jarl Svein rose from his seat with the measured dignity that characterized his responses to serious challenges, but those who knew him well could detect the tension in his movements. "How many ships?" the Jarl asked, his voice carrying the authority of a leader who had faced such threats before, but understood their gravity. 40 longships, my lord, perhaps 800 men, with more expected. Their leader is Magnus Ironjaw, who has sworn to claim your lands for the Danish crown." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled warriors. Magnus Ironjaw had earned his reputation through a combination of tactical brilliance and utter ruthlessness. His campaigns had left a trail of conquered settlements and broken enemies across the northern seas. That he had brought such a substantial force suggested intentions that went far beyond ordinary raiding. Bjorn had risen during the messenger's report, his mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had served him so well in previous conflicts. But as he prepared to join the inevitable war council, he found himself glancing toward Thyra, who sat perfectly still with her carving tools forgotten in her lap. The fear he saw in her expression, not for herself but for the community that had given her shelter, stirred protective instincts that threatened to interfere with his military judgment. For the first time in his career as a warrior, personal concerns competed with strategic necessities in ways that confused and troubled him. "We will need every advantage we can muster," Jarl Svein was saying to his assembled war leaders. "Magnus Ironjaw does not make mistakes, and he does not show mercy. Our response must be both swift and decisive." The discussion that followed covered the familiar territory of military preparation, defensive positions, supply lines, potential allies, and tactical options. But for Bjorn, these professional considerations were complicated by new factors that had not influenced his thinking in previous campaigns. The safety of the longhouse community had always been important, but now it carried personal weight that affected his assessment of acceptable risks. The traditional Viking approach of meeting enemies in open battle might succeed, but it could also expose the civilian population to dangers that felt unacceptable when he thought of Thyra's vulnerable position. As the War Council moved toward decisions about immediate preparations and longer-term strategy, Bjorn found himself advocating for defensive measures that would protect the community, even if they might limit offensive opportunities. His recommendations surprised some of the other leaders, who had expected him to favor the aggressive tactics that had served them so well in the past. The tension between professional duty and personal concern created internal conflicts that Bjorn had never experienced before, challenging his understanding of himself and his role in ways that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Meanwhile, throughout the Longhouse, the news of Danish invasion spread rapidly among servants, craftspeople, and family members who would bear the consequences of whatever decisions emerged from the War Council. Fear mixed with determination as people began the familiar but always frightening process of preparing for siege conditions and possible evacuation. Thyra gathered her precious carving tools and the few personal possessions that represented her entire inheritance but she also felt a deeper sadness at the thought of losing the community that had become her first real home since her parents' death. 3 days of intensive preparation had transformed the longhouse from a center of craft and celebration into a military stronghold. Warriors worked alongside servants to reinforce defenses, while smiths labored day and night to repair weapons and forge additional spearheads. The great hall, once filled with the sounds of storytelling and gentle conversation, now echoed with the harsh music of steel being sharpened and strategic plans being debated. Thyra found herself caught between usefulness and helplessness as the community prepared for siege. Her carving skills proved valuable for creating arrow points and small tools needed for defense preparations, but her blindness made many of the physical tasks impossible. She worked where she could contribute while trying not to become a burden to people whose attention was needed for more urgent matters. The emotional strain affected everyone, but perhaps none more than Bjorn, who found his usual clarity of purpose clouded by concerns he could not fully articulate. His strategic recommendations had become noticeably more conservative, favoring defensive positions that would protect civilians over offensive strikes that might achieve quicker victory. The change had not gone unnoticed by his fellow warriors, particularly Eric Bloodaxe, whose worry about his friend's altered priorities finally reached a breaking point. On the evening of the 3rd day, as snow fell heavily outside and the longhouse settled into the tense quiet that preceded action, Eric approached Bjorn in the armory, where the giant warrior was making final adjustments to Grimnir's edge. The ancient weapon gleamed in the lamplight, its runes seeming to pulse with anticipation of coming battle. "We need to talk," Eric said without preamble, his tone carrying the weight of years of friendship and shared dangers. Away from others. Bjorn looked up from his weapon maintenance, reading the serious concern in his friend's expression. Without argument, he set aside his whetstone and followed Eric to a small chamber used for private consultations. The room contained only a table, 2 chairs, and a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Your mind is divided," Eric said once they were alone, his words chosen with the care of someone who understood the potential dangers of such a conversation. In battle, divided attention kills warriors and loses wars. Magnus Ironjaw will not hesitate to exploit any weakness he perceives. Bjorn remained silent for a long moment, studying his friend's face and weighing how much truth he could safely reveal. Eric deserved honesty, but the full extent of his changed thinking might sound like madness or betrayal to a man whose entire worldview was built around traditional Viking values. "The girl has shown me perspectives I had not considered," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps strength can take forms other than destruction. Perhaps there are victories beyond those won through slaughter." Eric's expression hardened with the kind of frustration that comes from watching someone you care about make what appears to be a fatal error. "She is a crippled woman with pretty words and gentle manners. When Magnus Ironjaw comes with 800 warriors seeking blood and plunder, your perspective will not turn aside their weapons." The dismissive characterization of Thyra sparked anger in Bjorn that surprised him with its intensity. His hand moved instinctively toward Grimnir before conscious control reasserted itself. The near-violent response shocked both men and illustrated exactly the kind of compromised judgment that Eric feared. "She has more courage than many warriors I have known," Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying a warning edge that Eric recognized from battlefield situations. "Do not speak of her as lesser because she faces challenges you cannot understand." The defense confirmed Eric's worst fears about his friend's emotional involvement. In his view, Bjorn the Stonehand was allowing sentiment to compromise the ruthless efficiency that had made him the most feared warrior in Norway. Such weakness could doom not just Bjorn himself, but everyone depending on his leadership in the coming battle. "Then we must remove the source of this distraction," Eric said with the brutal directness that characterized his approach to difficult problems. "Send her away before the battle begins. Let her find shelter elsewhere while you focus on the work that only you can do." The suggestion struck Bjorn like a physical blow, revealing the depth of changes he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. The thought of Thyra leaving, of losing the gentle presence that had brought unexpected peace to his existence, seemed worse than the prospect of facing Magnus Ironjaw's entire army. "She stays," he said with finality that ended the discussion, but did nothing to resolve the underlying tensions. Their confrontation was interrupted by urgent knocking on the chamber door, followed by the entrance of a scout whose expression indicated news of critical importance. The man's clothing bore the marks of hard travel through winter conditions, and his obvious exhaustion suggested he had ridden without rest to deliver his message. "Forgive the intrusion, lords," the scout said, breathing heavily from exertion and cold, "but I bring intelligence that changes everything we thought we knew about Danish intentions." Bjorn and Eric exchanged glances, their personal conflict temporarily set aside in favor of military necessity. They followed the scout to the Great Hall, where Jarl Svein and the other war leaders were quickly assembling to hear whatever information had prompted such urgent delivery. The scout's report began with confirmation of what they already knew. Magnus Ironjaw's forces were indeed approaching in strength, equipped for extended siege warfare. But his next revelation struck the assembled leaders like lightning from a clear sky. "Magnus Ironjaw is not leading this force," the scout continued, his words carrying implications that reframed everything they thought they understood about their situation. "He was killed 3 days ago in a skirmish with Saxon raiders. The Danish army is now led by his lieutenant, a man called Ragnar the Bold, who lacks both his former commander's experience and his restraint." The news created immediate confusion among the war leaders, who had based all their preparations on assumptions about Magnus Ironjaw's proven tactical abilities and strategic thinking. A different leader meant different approaches to warfare, different strengths and weaknesses to exploit, and potentially different objectives entirely. But the scout's revelations were far from complete. His next words transformed confusion into something approaching shock. "There is more, my lords. The Danes are not seeking conquest of territory or the usual plunder of a successful raid. They come seeking a specific person, a woman whose father once served in Magnus Ironjaw's household and who supposedly possesses knowledge of Danish defensive positions and strategic plans." Jarl Svein leaned forward intently, his political mind immediately grasping the significance of such intelligence. "What woman? What knowledge?" The scout's answer struck the assembled leaders with the force of revelation and the chill of terrible irony. "The daughter of Olaf the farmer, my lord. A blind woman named Thyra, who they believe carries secrets that could determine the outcome of their war with the Saxon kingdoms." Silence fell over the great hall like a burial shroud as the implications became clear. The gentle woman who had won their affection through her skill and character, who had found safety in their community after losing everything, was the very person whose capture could justify a full-scale assault on their stronghold. Bjorn felt his world tilting as if the foundation of reality had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about Thyra's background, about her parents' simple life as farmers, about her innocent arrival, seeking nothing more than shelter and honest work. All of it was thrown into question by this revelation. The protective instincts that had been growing stronger with each passing day now warred with strategic necessities in ways that threatened to tear him apart. If the scout's intelligence was accurate, if Thyra truly possessed knowledge that the Danes valued above territorial conquest, then her presence in the longhouse represented both their greatest danger and their most valuable asset. Around the hall, voices began to rise as the war leaders debated the implications and argued about responses. Some called for immediately surrendering Thyra to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, while others insisted that yielding to Danish demands would only encourage further aggression. But Bjorn heard none of these discussions. His attention focused entirely on understanding how the gentle woman who had spoken of creating beauty rather than destruction could be connected to the world of military intelligence and international warfare. The woman who had transformed his understanding of strength and courage was apparently hiding secrets that made her valuable enough to justify a major military campaign. The revelation changed everything, while simultaneously changing nothing at all. Whatever Thyra's past might contain, whatever knowledge she might possess, she remained the person who had sat beside him without fear and spoken of scars becoming sources of strength rather than symbols of shame. The choice between duty and devotion, between strategic necessity and personal loyalty, would have to be made soon. But for the first time in his life as a warrior, Bjorn the Stonehand found himself uncertain which path honor truly demanded. The revelation about Thyra's past created an immediate and profound crisis within the longhouse community. War leaders who had been united in their determination to resist Danish aggression now found themselves divided about fundamental questions of strategy, honor, and survival. The Great Hall, which had served as a place of celebration and fellowship just days earlier, became an arena for heated debates that threatened to tear apart the very unity they needed to face their enemies. Jarl Svein called for calm deliberation, but the voices around him grew increasingly strident as the full implications of their situation became clear. Some warriors argued that surrendering Thyra would save hundreds of lives and preserve their community for future generations. Others insisted that yielding to Danish demands would mark them as cowards and invite further aggression from enemies who would see their weakness as opportunity. "We cannot sacrifice an innocent woman to save ourselves," declared Master Gunnar, his voice carrying the moral authority of age and respected service. "What manner of men would we be if we purchased safety through such betrayal?" Eric Bloodaxe stood to respond, his scarred face grim with the weight of military realities. "We would be men who choose to protect their families rather than indulge in noble gestures that accomplish nothing beyond ensuring everyone dies together." The debate might have continued indefinitely, but Bjorn's sudden movement toward the door brought immediate silence. Every person in the hall understood that his decision would carry more weight than all their arguments combined. His reputation, his relationship with the Jarl, and his unquestioned effectiveness as a military leader made his position crucial to whatever course they ultimately chose. But instead of adding his voice to the debate, Bjorn walked purposefully toward the chamber where Thyra had been quietly working on her carving despite the tumult around her. He found her exactly as he expected, seated calmly at her usual place, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she shaped a piece of antler into what appeared to be a small drinking cup. Her composure in the face of chaos impressed him once again, but he also detected subtle signs of tension in her posture that suggested she was not as unaffected by recent events as she appeared. The slight tightness around her eyes and the careful control of her movements spoke of someone maintaining dignity through force of will rather than genuine calm. "You heard the scout's report," Bjorn said quietly, settling onto the bench beside her with movements that seemed almost formal compared to their previous easy interactions. Thyra nodded without looking up from her work, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I heard, and I suspect you have questions that deserve honest answers." The simple acknowledgement opened floodgates that Bjorn had been holding closed through sheer determination. All his doubts about her background, his growing suspicions that her story contained elements she had not shared, and his desperate need to understand how the woman who had become so important to him could be connected to the forces now threatening everything he had sworn to protect, all of it poured out in a rush of carefully controlled words. "Who are you really?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than simple curiosity about her identity. "What knowledge do the Danes believe you possess? What secrets are worth 800 lives to obtain?" Thyra set down her carving tools and turned toward his voice with the kind of deliberate composure that comes from long practice at managing difficult conversations. When she spoke, her words carried both sadness and relief, as if sharing the truth might finally lift a burden she had carried too long. "My father was indeed Olaf the farmer," she began, her voice soft but clear. But he was not always a simple tiller of soil. In his youth, he served as a messenger and translator for various jarls, including Magnus Ironjaw. His knowledge of languages and his gift for remembering details made him valuable for diplomatic missions and intelligence gathering. The revelation explained much, while raising new questions about the complexity of Thyra's background and the reasons for her father's eventual retreat to farming. Bjorn found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet family that had lived peacefully near the coast, apparently far removed from the politics and warfare that shaped the broader world. When my mother lost her sight during the plague that swept through the region 15 years ago, my father chose to abandon his dangerous work and focus on providing a safe, stable life for his family, Thyra continued. But the knowledge he had gained during those years of service troop movements, defensive positions, supply routes, the personal weaknesses of various leaders, all of that remained in his memory. Bjorn began to understand the true scope of what the Danes sought. In an age when written records were rare and most intelligence was carried in human memory, someone with access to Magnus Ironjaw's strategic secrets would represent an invaluable asset. The information could determine the success or failure of entire campaigns, the survival or destruction of kingdoms. He shared this knowledge with you, Bjorn said, the statement carrying both understanding and concern about the burden such secrets must represent. Not intentionally, Thyra replied with a sad smile. But during the long winter evenings, when there was little work to be done, he would tell stories of his travels and the people he had met. I listened carefully, remembering everything because his words painted pictures more vivid than my eyes could ever provide. I did not realize until much later that his stories contained information that others might find valuable. The innocent explanation made the situation even more tragic in Bjorn's view. Thyra had become a repository of military intelligence, not through any deliberate choice or political involvement, but simply through a daughter's love for her father's stories. The knowledge that made her valuable to Danish forces was also the precious connection to parents she had lost, memories that could not be surrendered without losing part of herself. When the sickness took them, she continued, I knew that staying near our farm would eventually attract attention from people who remembered my father's former life. That is why I traveled so far seeking shelter. I hoped that distance might provide safety from those who would use me for purposes I could never support. The full weight of her situation became clear to Bjorn as she spoke. Thyra was not simply a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but someone who had made deliberate choices to protect both herself and the knowledge she carried. Her journey to their longhouse had been guided not just by need for shelter, but by a calculated attempt to disappear from the dangerous world that had claimed her father's youth and threatened her future. The Danes will not stop, Bjorn said quietly, voicing the harsh reality that neither of them could ignore. If they believe you possess information that could change the course of their wars, they will pursue you wherever you go. Today, it is Ragnar the Bold with 800 men. Tomorrow it might be someone else with even greater forces. Thyra nodded, her acceptance of this truth evident in her resigned posture. I know. That is why I must make a choice that will affect not just my own fate, but the safety of everyone who has shown me kindness. Before Bjorn could ask what choice she meant, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Astrid, whose expression indicated urgent news from the ongoing war council. The Jarl's wife approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested decisions had been reached and action would soon follow. Forgive the interruption, Astrid said formally, though her tone carried warmth despite the circumstances. But the council has reached certain conclusions that affect us all. Thyra, your presence is requested in the Great Hall. The summons carried implications that none of them could ignore. The war leaders had apparently decided how to respond to the Danish threat, and their decision would involve Thyra directly. Whether that meant protecting her, surrendering her, or something else entirely, remained to be determined. As they prepared to return to the hall where her fate would be decided, Thyra reached for Bjorn's hand with the kind of gesture that spoke of trust despite uncertainty. Her fingers, calloused from honest work but gentle from natural disposition, closed around his massive scarred palm with surprising strength. "Whatever they decide," she said quietly, "know that these weeks in your longhouse have been the happiest of my life since my parents died. Your friendship has meant more to me than safety or comfort or any material blessing." The simple statement struck Bjorn with more force than any weapon he had ever faced. In that moment, surrounded by the complex political and military calculations that would determine their future, he realized that his feelings for Thyra had evolved far beyond friendship or protective instinct. What he felt was love profound, transformative, and completely at odds with the life he had built around warfare and isolation. The recognition came too late to change the circumstances they faced, but it crystallized his understanding of what truly mattered. Whatever the War Council had decided, whatever dangers lay ahead, he would not allow Thyra to face them alone. Together, they walked toward the great hall where the most important battle of Bjorn's life was about to begin, not against Danish warriors, but against the forces that would separate him from the woman who had shown him what it meant to be human rather than merely a weapon of war. Behind them, the amber carving that Thyra had been working on caught the lamplight, its translucent surface seeming to glow with inner warmth despite the cold that surrounded them. The piece remained unfinished, its final form still hidden within the raw material, waiting for hands that might never have the chance to complete what they had begun. The symbolism was not lost on either of them as they prepared to face whatever judgment awaited in the hall where their story had first begun. The great hall had been transformed into a formal court when Thyra and Bjorn entered, with benches arranged to face Jarl Svein's high seat and torches placed to illuminate the proceedings with solemn dignity. The assembled warriors, craftsmen, and household members created an atmosphere of weighty deliberation, their faces reflecting the gravity of decisions that would affect not just their immediate survival, but their honor for generations to come. Jarl Svein rose as they approached, his bearing carrying the accumulated wisdom of decades spent making choices that balanced idealism with pragmatism. His weathered face showed the strain of recent hours, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the woman whose fate had become intertwined with their community's survival. "Thyra, daughter of Olaf," he began formally, "we have heard the intelligence brought by our scouts, and we understand the difficult position in which circumstances have placed both you and our household. The council has debated long about the proper course of action." The ritual formality of his words could not disguise the personal affection evident in his manner. Thyra had become more than a refugee seeking shelter. She was a valued member of their community, whose skills and character had earned genuine respect from everyone who knew her. "We face a choice between certainty and hope," the Jarl continued, his words chosen with care to acknowledge the complexity of their situation. "We can surrender you to Danish forces, ensuring immediate safety for our people, but accepting a precedent that would forever mark us as those who sacrifice innocence for convenience." A murmur of tension rippled through the assembled gathering as the first option was stated explicitly. Some faces showed relief that such a choice was being considered, while others reflected the kind of disgust that comes from hearing dishonorable options spoken aloud. "Alternatively," Jarl Svein said, his voice growing stronger, "we can choose to protect you as we would any member of our family, knowing that this decision will require us to face 800 Danish warriors in a battle that may cost many lives." The second option brought nods of approval from some quarters and expressions of concern from others. The moral choice seemed clear to those who valued honor above safety, but the practical implications could not be ignored by anyone responsible for the welfare of families and children. Thyra stood silently during this recitation, her composure remarkable given that her life and the lives of many others hung in the balance. Beside her, Bjorn remained equally still, though those who knew him well could detect the tension coiling within his massive frame like a spring under pressure. There is, however, a third possibility, the Jarl continued, one that offers hope for avoiding both dishonor and unnecessary bloodshed. We propose to use your knowledge not as a gift to our enemies, but as a weapon against them. This unexpected development caught everyone by surprise, including Thyra herself, whose slight intake of breath indicated that she had not anticipated such a strategic use of her dangerous inheritance. The idea transformed her from liability to asset, from burden to opportunity. Your father's intelligence about Danish defensive positions and supply routes could enable us to strike decisive blows against their forces before they can establish siege positions, Jarl Svein explained. Rather than waiting passively for attack, we could use superior knowledge to achieve victory with minimal losses on our side. The proposal generated immediate excitement among the younger warriors, who had chafed at the defensive strategy that seemed to concede initiative to their enemies. The possibility of turning the tables through intelligence advantage appealed to their aggressive instincts while addressing the practical concerns of those who feared prolonged siege conditions. But Thyra's response revealed complications that the council had not fully considered. "My lord," she said quietly, her voice carrying both respect and determination, "I appreciate the honor you do me by seeking to transform my burden into your advantage. But I cannot provide intelligence that would be used to kill Danish warriors who serve their leaders with the same loyalty that your men show to you." The moral complexity of her position struck the assembly like a physical force. The knowledge that could save their community came with ethical constraints that complicated its use. Thyra's refusal to enable killing, even of enemies who threatened her life, demonstrated the kind of principled consistency that commanded respect, even as it frustrated practical necessities. "The intelligence I possess could help you avoid Danish forces rather than destroy them," she continued thoughtfully. "Perhaps there are ways to use superior knowledge for protection rather than aggression." Bjorn found himself admiring her moral courage, even as he recognized the impossible position it created for military planning. Her willingness to limit the usefulness of her knowledge for ethical reasons exemplified the character that had drawn him to her, but it also highlighted the fundamental differences between their approaches to survival and conflict. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the community about the proper balance between idealism and pragmatism in times of crisis. Some supported Thyra's ethical stance as reflecting the highest values they claimed to uphold, while others argued that such scruples were luxuries they could not afford when facing extinction. As voices rose and positions hardened, it became clear that no consensus would emerge from further discussion. The choice would ultimately fall to those with the authority and responsibility to act decisively in the face of impossible alternatives. The sound of horns echoing across the snow-covered landscape brought all debate to an abrupt halt. The Danish horns echoed across the frozen landscape with the deep, haunting melody that had struck fear into communities throughout the northern seas for generations. From the longhouse walls, lookouts confirmed what everyone already knew: Ragnar the Bold had arrived with his formidable fleet, their dragon-headed ships cutting through the ice-rimmed waters of the fjord like predators approaching helpless prey. 800 men, as the scout reported, called down Thorvald from the watchtower, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp winter air. "They are making camp on the beach rather than attempting immediate assault. Ragnar seems to favor negotiation over battle, at least initially." The news provided temporary relief to those who had feared an immediate siege, but it also created new tensions around the central question of how to respond to whatever demands the Danish leader might present. The time for debate had ended, replaced by the urgent necessity of decisive action. Jarl Svein moved with the calm efficiency that had served him well through decades of leadership, issuing orders that transformed the longhouse from a place of discussion into a fortress prepared for either diplomacy or war. Warriors took positions along the defensive walls, while servants secured supplies and prepared the great hall to receive whatever delegation Ragnar might send. Bjorn found himself caught between his military duties and his personal concerns, as the community prepared for what might be their final hours of peace. His strategic mind understood the tactical requirements of their situation, but his emotional investment in Thyra's safety threatened to compromise the clear thinking that his role demanded. "You should prepare yourself," he said quietly to Thyra as they stood together near the central fire that had been the site of their first meeting. "Whatever Ragnar proposes, whatever choices we make, your life will change dramatically before this day ends." Thyra nodded, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver pendant that contained her mother's hair, the only remaining link to the peaceful life that had ended with her parents' death. "I have been preparing for such a moment ever since I learned what knowledge I carried. Perhaps it is time to stop running from responsibilities I never chose but cannot escape." Her words revealed a resolution that both impressed and terrified Bjorn. The woman who had sought nothing more than shelter and honest work was preparing to face consequences that could determine the fate of kingdoms. Her courage in accepting such a burden demonstrated the same strength that had enabled her to carve beauty from raw materials despite her blindness. Before he could respond, the great doors of the longhouse opened to admit a Danish delegation led by a man whose presence immediately commanded attention. Ragnar the Bold stood nearly as tall as Bjorn himself, though his build was leaner and his manner more diplomatic than the stereotypical berserker. His clothing was rich but practical, his weapons well maintained but not ostentatious, and his bearing that of a leader who preferred to achieve objectives through negotiation when possible. The Danish delegation advanced into the hall with the formal courtesy that governed such encounters, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. These were enemies meeting under a flag of truce, their mutual respect tempered by the knowledge that diplomatic failure would lead immediately to bloodshed. "Jarl Svein Ironbeard," Ragnar said formally, his voice carrying the authority of command and the confidence of superior numbers. "I come seeking the return of property that belongs to the Danish crown. Grant my request, and my forces will depart without harming your people or damaging your holdings." The euphemistic language could not disguise the reality that Ragnar was demanding the surrender of a human being, but his diplomatic approach suggested a preference for avoiding unnecessary violence. The offer represented a genuine opportunity to resolve the crisis without bloodshed if moral considerations could be set aside. "The woman you seek has placed herself under our protection," Jarl Svein replied with equal formality. "She came to us seeking shelter from hardship, not as a fugitive from justice. What claim does the Danish crown have upon someone who has committed no crime against your people?" Ragnar's response revealed the full complexity of the political situation that had brought 800 warriors to their doorstep. The knowledge she possesses was acquired through her father's service to Danish interests. That information belongs to us by right, regardless of how it came to reside in her memory. The legal argument was sophisticated but ultimately irrelevant to the moral questions that truly governed the situation. Whether Danish claims had technical validity mattered less than the fundamental issue of whether innocent people could be treated as property to be claimed and traded. "Knowledge belongs to those who possess it," Thyra said quietly, speaking for the first time since the delegation's arrival. "My father chose to leave Danish service and share his stories with his daughter. That was his right as a free man." Her intervention brought all attention to focus on the woman whose fate hung in the balance. Ragnar studied her with the keen assessment of someone evaluating both an asset and an adversary, while Bjorn tensed with protective instincts that threatened to override diplomatic necessity. The moment of truth had arrived, bringing with it consequences that would echo through generations of memory and legend. The tension in the great hall stretched taut as bowstring as Ragnar the Bold considered Thyra's words, his keen eyes studying the blind woman who dared to challenge Danish claims with such quiet dignity. The diplomatic dance had reached its crucial moment, where words would either prevent bloodshed or make it inevitable. "You speak with courage for someone in such a vulnerable position," Ragnar said finally, his tone carrying grudging respect despite the adversarial circumstances. "But courage alone does not change the reality of your situation. The knowledge you possess could save thousands of Danish lives in our coming campaigns against Saxon kingdoms. Can your conscience bear the weight of those deaths simply to preserve your freedom?" The question struck at the heart of Thyra's moral dilemma, forcing her to weigh her personal liberty against the lives of strangers whose faces she would never see. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had no clear answer, where any decision would carry terrible consequences for someone. Bjorn watched her struggle with the decision, his own protective instincts warring with his understanding of the broader implications. He had seen enough of warfare to know that Ragnar spoke truth about the value of superior intelligence in military campaigns. The knowledge Thyra carried could indeed determine who lived and died in battles yet to come. But it was Thyra herself who found the solution that had eluded everyone else, her voice carrying the calm certainty that comes from absolute moral clarity. "You speak of saving Danish lives," she said quietly, "but you came here prepared to take Norwegian lives, to claim what you believe is yours. What if there were a third path, one that could serve your people's needs without requiring anyone's death or enslavement?" Ragnar leaned forward with genuine interest, his diplomatic instincts recognizing the possibility of an outcome that might satisfy multiple parties. "What path do you suggest?" Thyra's proposal, when it came, demonstrated the same creativity that characterized her artistic work, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that others missed. "The intelligence I possess is 15 years old, gathered during my father's youth, when political situations were very different than they are today. Much of what he learned is no longer accurate, superseded by changes in leadership, alliances, and defensive preparations." The observation struck both Danish and Norwegian listeners as obviously true once stated, but no one had previously considered how the passage of time might have affected the value of Olaf's ancient intelligence. Information that had once been precious might now be largely worthless, except for historical context. "However," Thyra continued, "I also learned my father's methods for gathering current intelligence, his techniques for reading political situations and assessing military capabilities. Those skills could be taught, creating ongoing value rather than the single use of outdated information." The proposal transformed the entire dynamic of their negotiation, offering something more valuable than static knowledge, the ability to acquire new intelligence as circumstances changed. It was exactly the kind of innovative solution that appealed to leaders who thought strategically rather than merely tactically. Ragnar's response revealed his sophistication as both diplomat and military commander. "You offer to share techniques in exchange for what assurances?" "Freedom for myself, and safety for the community that gave me shelter," Thyra replied, without hesitation. "I will spend 1 year teaching your intelligence gatherers everything my father taught me, in exchange for your word that no Danish forces will threaten these people or their holdings." The bargain offered genuine value to both sides, while avoiding the moral complications that had made other solutions unacceptable. Ragnar would gain ongoing intelligence capabilities rather than temporary information, while Thyra would preserve both her freedom and her ethical principles. But the proposal also created new complications, particularly for Bjorn, whose feelings for Thyra made the thought of her departure almost unbearable. A year in Danish service might ensure her safety and satisfy Ragnar's needs, but it would also separate them at the very moment when their relationship had begun to transcend friendship. The giant warrior struggled with competing loyalties, his duty to support solutions that protected his community and his desperate desire to keep Thyra safely by his side. The internal conflict reflected the fundamental transformation he had undergone since that first night, when she had unknowingly sat beside the most feared man in Norway. Jarl Svein recognized both the wisdom of Thyra's proposal and the personal cost it would exact from his most valuable warrior. His response demonstrated the kind of leadership that balanced practical necessities with human considerations. "The proposal has merit," he said formally, "but we would require certain modifications to ensure that all parties honor their commitments. Thyra would provide the agreed instruction, but under Norwegian protection, and with the understanding that she remains free to determine her own future once the year is complete." The counter-proposal preserved Thyra's autonomy while addressing Ragnar's needs and preventing her complete removal from the longhouse community. It was exactly the kind of diplomatic compromise that experienced leaders used to transform potentially destructive conflicts into mutually beneficial arrangements. Ragnar's acceptance came after long consideration, his agreement sealed with the formal ceremonies that made such pacts binding under both Danish and Norwegian law. The treaty that emerged from their negotiations would be remembered as an example of how wisdom and creativity could resolve seemingly impossible conflicts. As the Danish delegation prepared to depart with their new alliance secure, Thyra found herself standing once again beside Bjorn near the central fire where their story had begun. The amber carving that she had been working on throughout the crisis lay finished on the nearby table, its translucent surface catching the firelight and seeming to glow with inner warmth. "The year will pass quickly," Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying hope despite the uncertainty ahead. Thyra smiled with the same gentle radiance that had first captivated him weeks earlier. "And when it does, I will return to continue what we started here. Some bonds are strong enough to survive separation, and some stories are worth the patience required to tell them properly." Around them, the Longhouse community celebrated the peaceful resolution of their crisis, but for Bjorn and Thyra, the real celebration lay in the promise of a future, together one built on understanding, respect, and the kind of love that transforms both the giver and the receiver. The blind woman who had accidentally sat beside a giant Viking had indeed changed his life forever, proving that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simplest acts of courage and kindness.